But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we uncover the story of John Rabe, a German businessman who became an unlikely hero during the Nanjing Massacre. A Nazi party member and Siemens executive, he risked everything to protect thousands of Chinese civilians, using his influence to create a refuge amid unimaginable horror. Was he a hero trapped in the wrong ideology, or simply a man who chose to do what was right? Join us as we explore his extraordinary story. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're moving into World War II and Nanjing specifically. And we're going to talk about someone who's pretty unknown to history, at least in the mainstream, and that's John Rabe. And so we're going to be talking about the Nanjing Massacre today, and it's probably one of the most atrocious massacres that, we have detailed records for. But it's such a dark time in history. But at the end of it, we do see some of humanity's best things come forward. And I think that's what John Rabe puts to the forefront here. And I think this conversation will get dark, but it'll also get hopeful at the same time. And I think that's kind of the takeaway from all of this is, we've got a terrible situation with a really good person. And he also happens to be a Nazi, which I think this is another little wrinkling to throw in there that, someone who should be considered a really terrible person in a really terrible time actually just ends up being a shining light.
I think that's extremely well put. Yeah. There's a lot we're going to cover here. He's a very interesting historical figure. I don't think he gets the notoriety that he deserves for the role that he played in the massacre in terms of defending, against what was happening. We'll get into the details a little bit later in the episode. And I think, a lot of the conflict or like historical tension for people who are aware of him and what happened in Nanjing, against the broader onset of World War II is that label of Nazi. He was a card-carrying member of the Nazi party. So where does that leave us? And I think, we'll obviously have to discuss it for the purpose of this episode, but I think contentiously speaking, it really does make fans of history consider what does it mean to be, a good or a bad person? Because I know we love these binaries when we talk about history, but it's not always so clear. And I think this is a really good case study in how unclear those boundaries can actually be.
Yeah, when you look at someone like John Rabe, you would see somebody who's maybe wants to put people in a box, say he's literally a Nazi, a literal Nazi. And it's like, yeah, he is. He is a card-carrying Nazi, and it's going to catch up with him in his life because he was a card-carrying Nazi. But I think you've put it perfectly. What does it actually mean to be a Nazi? We talked about this with Werner von Braun way back many episodes ago, where we're like, yeah, he was a card-carrying Nazi, but was it a means to an end? Did he actually believe in what the Nazis stood for? Or was it just kind of the thing that you had to do? And I think with John Rabe, it's interesting because not only do we have to consider all of those things, he's on the other side of the globe in a city that's going to be at war with Germany's ally. And I think that changes, is a whole nother dynamic on top of this outside of just being, a Nazi in China. He's seeing the Japanese war machine coming towards him, and, he's got his swastika on his arm. He's a German speaker. They know who he is. And I think that's going to, it will add a different wrinkling to it. But I think it's just another level that we have to throw in with John Rabe here.
I think that's probably one of the layers of difficulty in such an episode, right? And it probably goes also to speak to why, the massacre that we're going to talk about isn't as well, I'm not going to say documented, but as talked about as other horrific events that we talk about in World War II. Obviously, the Holocaust comes to mind, and rightfully so. That is one of the, most horrific periods in human history. And the massacre that we're going to talk about in Nanjing happens, just before the official kickoff of World War II. But I think it gets lost in the massive chaos and suffering that ensues in this theater of war. And I think in many ways this episode is about Rabe, but it's also in many ways about this massacre, because I think to have a discussion about him, you can't not have a discussion about the massacre.
Absolutely. That's what he's known for, his writings and everything about that time. And I think to your point on it not being really understood is, when you talk to the maybe average World War II not historian, or someone who's interested in history, or someone who knows about World War II in a casual sense, to tell them, oh, the Chinese lost a lot of people, or the Chinese have been fighting basically the beginning. Japan and China fighting was maybe the beginning, or very close to the beginning of what we would consider the World War II period. Some people don't even know that China was really even in this war. And when you look at, the amount of dead and captured and civilian deaths, China's right up there with, Germany, Soviet Union, Japan. They had a lot of terrible, terrible things happen to their country, and a lot of great people it's war, right? These are the things that happen. But it is interesting as Westerners, you definitely don't really think too much about, China fighting the Japanese in this sense. And I think that's why this massacre kind of went a little bit under the rug. And we had both read The Rape of Nanking, and, the author in that book basically saying that she wrote the book for Westerners, and herself being an American, is not a lot of people knew about this, and she was surprised at how little was known about, something that killed hundreds of thousands of people in such a short period of time. And, when you look at all the terrible things that happened during the war that, are very well documented, this should be up there with the Holocaust. We should talk about the Holocaust, and we should talk about this massacre just based on the absolute, scale and brutality of it all. It doesn't really come to the surface. And I think the best way to tell this story, though, because you don't necessarily want to just tell this story as there was a massacre. A lot of Japanese did a lot of terrible things to a bunch of Chinese civilians and then call it a day. I think it's telling this story through someone like John Rabe's eyes. I think it just adds a little bit more of a human element to it, because he's essentially, you could say, somewhat neutral party. His country is allied with Japan, but he has a true love for China because we'll get into, how he establishes himself there. And what does somebody like this do, and how do they manage all of that? And I think that's what going to make this episode so great, is we're going to learn about something really terrible, but we're going to see it through the eyes of, the only person who's got all of these dynamics going on within that region.
I think in many ways, this episode or his story is kind of indicative of in life in many ways, right? Like in all of the darkness and horrific things that humans can do to each other, if you look hard enough, there may be a slight sliver of light, right? And I think in many ways, Rabe is kind of in representative of that potential optimism or hope that you can find if you look hard enough in what is potentially one of the most horrific events in modern human history.
Without question. And I think with someone like John Rabe, he's born at a really interesting time too, right? Because we just kind of set the scene, right? He's, a German living in Nanjing. He's been in China for a long time. World War II is about to start, but we were just chatting about this offline. He's born in 1882 in Hamburg, and he's right at the tail end of this Otto von Bismarck unification of Germany. And in my head, I can't, it seems like lifetimes of difference between the era of being born into the world of Otto von Bismarck and dying in a post-Hitler Germany. There are so many things that happened in between that time. But I think what you were kind of mentioning to me offline, Richie, was, Hamburg, right? 1882. This is a very special place. And he's born at a very special time in German history where, the big industry and the big push for Germany to really become a superpower is already in flux, and it's about to hit, probably another level. As the century kind of comes to a close.
Yeah, because I know we're going to be talking a lot about China and Asia, but, we have to start back at home for Rabe, and that's Hamburg. And, in 1882, Hamburg, and, this is something that I didn't even really consider when we started researching for this episode, is that Hamburg is, I think it's quite accurately described as a very vibrant, bustling port city. And it really is the beacon of commerce, culture, and rapid industrial transformation at this time. It has sprawling docks, busy marketplaces, and it's not merely this kind of backdrop for daily life. It is this living, breathing city. It's a very dynamic city within this nation that's kind of on a rise. There's a lot of seafaring tales. There's the modern hum of industry. And young Rabe he's exposed to all this early confluence of tradition and innovation. The city's rich maritime history and its status as a gateway to the wider world meant ideas, goods, and cultures were constantly in flux. It's a story as old as time. And it's a fact that would leave a lasting imprint on his character. So he grew up in the late 19th century, Hamburg. And, his formative years unfolded during a period marked by both, optimism and challenges of rapid change. The educational system in Hamburg was very robust. It emphasized not only, academic excellence, but also the development of discipline, civic responsibility, and a very strong work ethic. Schools and local community centers played a pivotal role in shaping the minds of young Germans. They instilled a, very strong sense of duty and pride in contributing back to society. And I think these early lessons acquired through rigorous study and participation participation in this social life in his neighborhood definitely helped form a very, pragmatic and resilient outlook that we're going to see in his later years.
It reminds me a lot of when we talked about Vasco da Gama and Magellan, where they were born into Portugal, where it was the exploration capital of the world, and seafaring and navigation was just so huge. And it's like, of course they went into that industry. And you see it with Hamburg too. It's a little bit more diversified in the sense that there's a lot of different types of commerce that are happening here, but commerce is that element. And we'll even see with John is it's not just staying within Hamburg and participating in whatever sort of business opportunities are there. This is a gateway to the entire world because businesses are now going global for maybe not the first time, but at a scale which really hadn't been seen outside of, some of like the East India companies and certain kind of government-backed militaristic type companies of the past. These are, we'll talk about Siemens, we'll talk about these big companies where, he's going to start moving around. But I think it's an interesting parallel of, you're born into this world and it's a great opportunity to be at the forefront of something in history, and he just happens to be there. And it's like, of course he went into that industry, and he finds his way into that globalized commerce that Hamburg is really pushing throughout the world and being really at the epicenter from a European standpoint, at least.
Yeah, I think there's definitely this, I hate to call it a coincidence, but there is this kind of reality about his proximity, or even like Vasco da Gama's example, because that's exactly what came to mind when I was writing this up. Being so close in proximity to such a dynamic city has to have an impact on your psyche versus growing up in some rural town and, having your, formative years spent outside of it. I think it does create a dramatic shift. And I think even in this case, right, like economically, you just mentioned it, Paul, it's a thriving center of trade. Its ports serve as conduits for goods and ideas from across Europe and beyond. And it's taking a very modern look of globalization, right? This exposure to international commerce, this constant influx of diverse cultures provided him with, I would imagine a very early and probably informal education in global affairs. And this wider exposure, probably would have led him and planted the seeds of this much broader perspective that we're going to see later on in his life, influencing his ability to operate effectively in varying international contexts as an adult. But in the same time, right, like I think it's important to keep in mind, as much as there is, this massive transformation happening, there is, innovative commerce that's happening around him, family and community also plays a significant role in his early life. While details of his background are a bit sparse, it seems that, evidently speaking, he values hard work. There's a responsibility to civic duty, all of which are deeply ingrained in him. And this kind of collective experience of living in a bustling urban center where community ties are still very strong with the challenges of modernization, where met with this kind of communal effort in a way, really does a great job in developing a sense of loyalty and commitment to those around him. Themes that I think we're going to see time and time again sprinkled across this episode. And I think these very early but formative experiences are going to manifest, and we'll see how they manifest and how they are actually, how they impact his actions later in life. Absolutely.
And I think you foreshadowed really well. Like, there's no way he's able to do what he does without being exposed to that, at a young age as he's growing up and, in his formative years, of the importance of community and, respecting the people around you, and then understanding that you didn't just get to where you were by yourself. You had a lot of great people to help you along the way. And, that's important to continue. But I think too, what you mentioned of being in Hamburg, in this city that's got so much going on from an international commerce perspective, and his ability to see that, I would say, global element of how to do business and dealing with different people coming in and out of the city all the time, goes directly into kind of where he started working. So he starts working for an export firm. So he's shipping stuff all over the world and dealing with all of these international trade elements. And, he starts as an apprentice. He works there for 2.5 years. And then his boss recommends that, hey, you should go to Mozambique, which was still a Portuguese colony in Southeast Africa, where he worked for a well-established English firm. He learned to speak English, but unfortunately had a pretty significant bout of malaria and was forced to return home in 1906. So right away, working for an export firm, going to Southeast Africa, working in a Portuguese colony, learning English, talk about being, I would say, international in a sense of learning these different languages, being on a different continent. But it's continued. So he embarked now on the journey that would probably change his life, and definitely change his life. He ends up moving to Beijing. And when he gets to Beijing, he's hired as a clerk. And this is around 1910. He was hired as a clerk at the Beijing office of Siemens China & Co., which is a the Chinese distributor of Siemens. So Siemens being the same Siemens that you're thinking about today, one of the largest electrical and technology type companies around the world. Lots of automation, robotics, all that fun stuff. They're still huge today and were really big back then. And he did so well at that position that he was offered a promotion within a few years and really started to be able to act on his own authority on behalf of the company. And that's important when you're working overseas for a company. You need to be able to do things independently without having to always call home and make sure that, the head office in Germany is okay with something, especially in that time. There's no email, there's no, phone calls are very difficult to do, if anything, very expensive. It's a lot of telegrams still, I'm sure. And so he continues to do that. And it's kind of a gap in his history a little bit. It's like, 1910, 1915, he's promoted. Okay, now it's 1931. And he's been transferred to the Siemens office in Nanjing, which is the capital of China at the time, where he's been given the role of managing director. So I think it's important to just recognize here, he's been in China for almost 20 years already, and we don't really get a lot of detail about his life, but it's important to know that, started with one company, worked for them for 20 years. Now he's the managing director of Siemens China. And, the rest is, I would say, is history, but it's important to understand that, he is very much grew up in Germany, but he's almost lived in China more than he's spent his time in Germany. Or at least he spent more time abroad at this point than he has, living in Hamburg.
I think that's such an interesting point that I don't know if it's worth overstating, but I think it could definitely risk the chance of being understated, right? Here is someone who is a card-carrying Nazi member who has spent the majority of his adult life outside of Germany. I think that's a very interesting nuance. I don't think we need to get too far into it, but I think for our listeners, and at least for me, that is a very stark difference in someone who spent the majority of their life in the country that they were born working for Siemens. Right. I think it's a very important distinction. Maybe before we even get too far, I know maybe it's just worth speaking about what's going on in Germany at this point, just quickly. So up until he leaves for China, Germany is obviously going through a very profound transformation. They're moving from the crippling aftermath of World War I and economic collapse to a state of, very intense militarized nationalism and totalitarian control. This is where we're seeing the rise of the Nazi Party, the rise of the Weimar Republic. And, this environment is going to influence the choices of its citizens in many ways, as we know today, and also set the stage for Rabe in many ways because of the complex roles that he's going to have to play on the stage as a member of the Nazi Party, but also managing director of Siemens China.
Yeah. And it's funny because, as you mentioned, all of that's going on. He's not really in Germany for all of the, just hearing the general discourse of, hey, end of World War II is so terrible. Our economy is in the toilet. I'm sure he's obviously hearing these things tangentially and when he goes back to Germany to visit, but it's not like he's in it every single day and getting caught up in all the, firestorm that's coming with the rising anti-Semitism, the rising nationalism and militarism. He's in China and he's living in a completely different world at this point. And, I like when you look at his diaries, there's just some things that I love because we have to remember he's just a guy like anybody else. He's a managing director. He's German. He's living in China. But just one of the stories in his diary, it's just so normal. I love it. He talks about how, hey, he goes, I woke up, jumped on the streetcar, went over, grabbed some groceries, came home, put the groceries away. Then a friend from Germany was coming to visit. We went to see the sights and then we went to the cinema and we watched a movie. And that's it. That's the day. And it's like, of course, he's a regular person like anybody else. He just happens to be living in China. That's really all this is.
And I think even on that point, right, and it's probably worth just stating it here because, the whole him being a Nazi thing is front and center for a lot of historical discussions on him, which I think is almost reductive in a way because it takes away from the story we're about to get into. So I wanted to see what some historians said about him. And it seems like, historians have noted that many German expats of that era joined the Nazi Party more out of this pragmatic necessity than genuine ideological commitment. And I think there's historians like John W. Dower, had discussed in his work how many Germans abroad actually found membership in the party to be a survival strategy in an increasingly oppressive system rather than a wholehearted endorsement of ideology, of the Nazi ideology, and that it actually provided a bit of, authority in foreign lands that could be used and leaned on if, they ever found themselves in a situation where they needed to garner support from, their homeland.
Absolutely. And I think for someone like John Rabe, if he was really buying into this whole master race sort of, spiel that the Nazis were doing, I think he probably wouldn't have lasted very long in China around, very few of the pure Aryans as, Hitler would have preferred, right? So there's clearly something that he's not buying into here. And we see that in his writings. He doesn't talk about, hey, I'm in China and, thinking lesser of, the people that he's around, or talking about, as a good Aryan, those sort of things. Like, you don't really see much of that. And it's not till 1934 when he joins the Nazi Party. And I think based on timelines of when the Nazis actually became, in power, that makes some sense. And his claim afterwards, and again, this might be a little bit of him kind of looking back and trying to find a good narrative for it, but it does line up with his character. He basically wants to found a German school in Nanjing on his property. Not for his kids. His kids were past the age of going to school, and his son was back in Germany at boarding school. But he wanted to get funding to do this, and to do so, he needed to essentially join the Nazi Party so he could run as the chairman of this school. So he looks back and basically says, after the war, people accused him of just joining the party for his own political advantage. And he says in his writings, and this is after the war, he goes, I dispute this very energetically and pointed out that the only reason, among others, for my joining the party was to receive a subsidy from the German Reich to create a German school in Nanjing. So that's what he says after the war. And so, we'll get into why there's a little bit of nuance we have to throw into that comments, just based on it's after the war, and being a Nazi is obviously not a good thing. But he's described as a simple man, values common sense, likes a bit of a sillier guy as well, and he's just really interested in German commerce and German foreign policy, specifically within Asia. That's his bread and butter. That's why he's there. That's his job. But he doesn't really seem to care too much about politics. We don't see a lot of that from him. He's just a businessman in China, trying to make sure that Germany and China are able to do great trade, and Siemens is at the forefront of that. So that, I think, is kind of the person he is. At the end of the day, like you said, he's a card-carrying Nazi, which seems like it was more for, it was the thing to do, and ends up actually probably saving his life down the line. But also, he says, hey, I just want to open a school, and I couldn't do that unless I join the party.
I think there's definitely a degree of pragmatism there, right? And I can't blame him for that. He's obviously someone who's very astute, very hardworking, very disciplined, takes his career very seriously, and is someone who's very ambitious. If, carrying that card is going to provide you some leeway or some benefits, I don't see why someone in his position wouldn't do that. But I think this is where the complexity and the difficulty in this analysis is, right? Can we consider him a Nazi in the sense that most people consider Nazis in 2025? And for me personally, I don't think I can. And obviously that's with doing a couple days worth of research on this episode. I don't know if anyone else has the time to do such things as a hobby, but I think for me at least, it's not the same thing as if it were looking at someone who is fighting, on the front lines for the German cause, or is actively involved on the ground with the Nazi Party in Germany. To me, those are two very separate issues and circumstances.
Definitely. And I think, like we talked about, von Braun is a little bit more of a gray area because, his project was using Jewish slaves to build his rockets. But you can even almost see you kind of asking the question here. Rabe is just so out of all of that. And again, there's just nothing there that I can really any meat to that to say, yeah, he actually believes in this ideology, and that's something that he found to be part of him as an identity or anything like that. It's just kind of a means to an end. And his kids have even said, yeah, he talked about, he was more interested in the socialist elements of the Nazi Party and thought, hey, maybe there's some interesting ideas that they might have that's going to come new. But, he's not in Germany. He's not really involved in really understanding what's happening. And we'll see when he goes back to Germany, trying to get Hitler to basically help out with, hey, the Japanese did all these terrible things, and here's the evidence. And I'm assuming you're going to be sympathetic to this. And I'm sure Hitler kind of, didn't give him a look physically, but probably looked at some of those things that he sent over and went, you do realize what we're doing here, right? But with all that being said, war is coming to Nanjing, and the Japanese and the Chinese have already been at war for a while. The Japanese have invaded Manchuria. They've been moving south into China. And the biggest thing is they finally take Shanghai. And so by taking Shanghai, you have the Yangtze River, which moves west, and you've got a bunch of big cities along the way. And on that way is Nanjing, the capital of China, which doesn't have maybe the economic power of Shanghai, but it's got that cultural element, and it's the capital, right? If you can take Nanjing, for the Japanese, this is a huge win. So Rabe starts to see, Japanese troop movements, seeing the elements of war. There's air raids, those sort of things. And when Shanghai falls, the people of Nanjing know that the writing's on the wall, right? This war is going to be coming to them very, very soon. And based on the success that the Japanese army has had against the Chinese, and especially with just how powerful, this is like Japan at its peak in terms of their imperialist power. They're coming, and they're coming fast. And, there's a lot of fear within this city that, the war is coming, and it's going to be really, really bad for all the people that live there.
I think it's probably important to mention right now we talked at length about what's going on in Germany, pre and post World War I. And, I don't think that should detract from what's going on in China as well, because there is a massive transformation that's happening by the late 1930s. China is also a nation that's at a crossroads. It's caught in between the throes of both internal division, mounting external aggression from Japan. Internally, right, the Republic of China is grappling with a very, very bitter civil war between the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek and the emerging communist forces as well. So the internal struggle, often set aside in the face of the more immediate external threat, had already weakened the central government's grip and fragmented the nation's political landscape. And then, Paul, you had mentioned externally, Japan is just running hot right now with their imperial ambitions. That's a nation that has rapidly transformed the regional balance of power. Following years of mounting tension and very provocative incursions, Japanese forces, have continued to launch full-scale invasions, marking the onset of what would become the second, Sino-Japanese war with, the brutal attack on Nanjing that we were just talking about.
Yeah, you're right. It's the war machine is in full swing here. And, this is when we start to look at Japan, like they can't be stopped. And, we talked about a couple episodes back on Emerald Yamamoto and just the whole change in Japan and how, the training and the discipline of all the young boys and men in Japan is coming to a point of, strong discipline and a little bit of brutality to get the job done, for their country. And, we talked about how this came off of a lot of national embarrassment over the centuries on when Japan refused to modernize militarily and then eventually were forced to, and they did it so quickly and had to sign all these treaties that were just embarrassing to them. I think this is Japan, I guess, reaping the rewards of all the work that they put in to really modernize. And now they've taken it another step of, okay, well, Japan's powerful. We can defend ourselves. Now we want a little bit of everything that's around us. And like you said, Richie, they're coming hard to Nanjing. And so in preparation for this, John Rabe was the chairman of the International Committee. So within a lot of these foreign cities within this time period, especially Nanjing being a great example, was you had an international community. You had Americans there, you had Germans there, you had British people there, and they all kind of lived within these international communities. So you'd have doctors, you'd have professors who were studying at the university there, all these type of different roles of people, and all from all over the world, and essentially kind of operated semi-independently from what the government was doing, especially in these cities. And they would have these essentially they'd have these sections kind of tapered off for these international communities. And John Rabe, being the chairman of this, creates this safety zone. He basically said to the people of Nanjing and to the Chinese government, look, we got to create a safety zone, because when this war comes, the children, the men, the women who are non-combatants, they need a safe place to go. We need to be able to feed them, or we're going to have a humanitarian crisis, because this is going to get really bad. And at the same time, we can tell the Japanese, look, there's no combatants here. This is the area where all of the refugees are going to go. And based on some decency in war, you would hope that the Japanese aren't going to attack or bomb that area. And so that's what he starts doing. He starts trying to make preparations for this, bring in a ton of food, start stocking up on rice, all of these sort of things to get ready for this invasion. And at the same time, though, he's struggling, because he's sitting here going, okay, hold on, a war is about to take place. I don't really have to be here. I can go back to Germany if I really need to. I'm not going to lose everything if I decide to leave. And to be honest, they probably want me to come back because it's such a risk. But not only is this now his home, he's been there for over 20 years. Like this is his home away from home, and probably is so ingrained in that society. But also, he writes that he's really worried about his employees. He has a lot of Chinese employees that rely on him. And he's like, I can't just abandon these people. I got to help them out, and he's seeing it from just hey, I got to make sure everybody survives, people get fed, and nobody gets killed that doesn't need to get killed. And I think that's his philosophy. So he's made the decision to stay. He's starting to build a safety zone, and essentially the waiting game begins as the Japanese army, starts rolling down, getting closer to Nanjing.
I think there's just a couple important things that really strike me and a couple of things that you mentioned. One, we did some foreshadowing at the beginning that kind of ideal of civic duty and responsibility to his community definitely starts to rear its head right now. You can see this is someone who probably had one of the easiest outs to get out of Nanking at this point, right? He could have left at drop of a pin, but he chose not to. I think that says a lot about his character. And even when we're talking about the safety zone, right? This isn't some government-sanctioned military safe haven. This is like a ragtag group of international people who have like 3 to 4 square kilometers of safety zone where they are directly negotiating with the oncoming Japanese officials who are putting themselves under extreme personal risk. The fact that he survived is incredible, especially when you start getting into the actual heinous violence that is about to, loom on Nanking.
You're right. Like it is really important to mention that, and I'm glad you did. This isn't some military compound that they've built with armed guards outside and barbed wire. This is okay from Main Street to 3rd Street into this street into this street. That's the I'm doing air quotes, safety zone. And so if you're in here, we'd consider you safe. And they actually started planning for over 200,000 people to move into the safety zone. So this isn't, like you said, this is just some ragtag group of people who have their own levels of skills and are just trying to make this work. And on top of that, a lot of city officials are leaving. So a lot of just the basic things that a city needs to do, like who's going to organize the police, who's going to do any housing regulations, who's going to be the fire department, who's going to watch over the utilities, sanitation, food supply. No one's monitoring that. And this all falls on this international committee in the safety zone. So it ends up becoming a mix of these international people who are in the city and local Chinese people who are working together to try to put some level of government here while all hell is essentially about to break loose.
And I think in many ways too, right? What starts as an attempt to provide safety for the inhabitants of Nanking, ultimately, as we see, becomes more than like this temporary refuge, right? Just having read Iris Chang's book, it almost becomes a symbol of like powerful defiance against the Japanese, because the odds were totally stacked against them, right? I didn't know about the international safety zone prior to reading that book. And I think, when I look back on that experience, I was just waiting for something horrible to happen to Rabe and his compatriots. But, they were able, in the face of overwhelming odds, to maintain the safety zone. There are countless setbacks that they have to deal with, but their determination to shield the innocent lives from the horrors that were raining down outside of the safety zone is nothing short of remarkable.
Yeah, and you even see Rabe sending telegrams to Hitler, basically saying like, my Führer, I need help. We need to send, supplies and anything you can. You need to help negotiate with the Japanese. He's doing that even through the American ambassador. And, the Chinese government says, great, set up a safety zone. We're not going to interfere. And the Japanese were like kind of giving them like a half answer. So this whole time, like to your point of the risk is huge, because the Japanese aren't going, yeah, look, if you stick all those people in the safety zone, we'll be fine. We'll deal with everything that's outside of it. And we're going to take the city, but we'll leave that part alone. He doesn't know that they're just not going to show up, take over the safety zone, execute all the international people. It would be a very bad look for Japan, especially with neutral countries like Americans getting killed in this situation. But you just don't know, right? And we're about to see that, when the Japanese show up, there's, order is the last thing that is set up in the city at this point. So I think you're right. Like the level of risk here is just so monumental. And you're right. Like the fact that he survives this, and let alone is semi-successful, I think just goes to show that, there's a little bit of luck, but also just, I think, goes to his level of skill and having some good people around him. Yeah.
And I know we've been talking around the massacre itself, but maybe we can get into some details about it now. If anyone is interested, I would definitely urge them to read Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanking. It is a dark book. It is very well written. It's very well researched. It will stay with you for a couple of days. That is my experience, but it's definitely worth a read. So the Rape of Nanking, also known as the Nanjing Massacre, is a period that I can only describe of as something to do with, extreme brutality and almost no regard for human life or human rights. And that unfolded over several weeks during the capture of Nanjing by Japanese forces in December 1937. During this time, the invading troops committed widespread atrocities against Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers alike. The violence was systematic. It was relentless. Japanese soldiers engaged in mass executions, often rounding up entire groups of people, killing them en masse in public or in very secretive settings. Estimates of the death toll vary greatly, with many historians kind of suggesting that between 200,000 to 300,000 people lost their lives during this very dark period. I think we've seen estimates that are almost 2 times that. And one of the most harrowing aspects of the massacre was the sexual violence against women. Tens of thousands of women and girls were subjected to brutal sexual assault and rape, often in the most degrading and violent circumstances imaginable. These acts of violence were in no way isolated incidents, but rather a pattern of, a broader pattern of dehumanization and terror inflicted by the occupying troops. And in addition to these crimes, the city itself was subjected to extensive looting and arson. Properties are ransacked, cultural treasures are destroyed. And I think that's an important one too, right? Nanjing has a very storied heritage and history at this point. So taking away from the city, ransacking it, destroying these cultural treasures really does a lot to the psyche of the society that's in it, especially, the Chinese government as well. So this chaos is compounded by the breakdown of any semblance of law or order. And Japanese soldiers are essentially acting, with impunity under a command structure that at best seemingly turned a blind eye or even maybe tactically approved their action. And I think the impact of the massacre has resonated far beyond its immediate aftermath. And I think, Paul, you and I have mentioned it a couple times now that it is probably one of the most infamous episodes of wartime atrocity, symbolizing the very extreme human cost of military aggression and the devastating effects of dehumanization and conflict. And, I think those are themes that we often talk about when we talk about World War II. It just happens to be that, at least, in our education, I can imagine this was never brought up when we studied it growing up.
Absolutely. And I hate to always do the comparison to the Holocaust because I think just they've happening around the same time period. The numbers are comparable based on the time frames that they happen in. And at times I sit here and I see everything that happens in Nanking and we're talking about, we're just touching the surface. If we're not going to share the details because, if you're willing to do so, I think it's important that everybody understands the details, but, essentially killing becomes a sport and sexual violence becomes a sport. And, like you said, there's the disregard for human life. If there's a word that's higher than that, I would like to find it because there's disregard I still think is understating it. But even like comparing it to the Holocaust, which was more, government sanctioned systemic genocide, this one scares me a lot because I wouldn't say the Japanese said, hey, go into Nanjing and do whatever you want. It was more they didn't do anything to stop it and kind of just let things happen. And without that control factor and the military kind of cracking down, these are the things that can happen. And there's definitely circumstances with the way, like we had talked about over a couple episodes back, of just how the Japanese soldier and young men were kind of trained and, what was kind of inbred in kind of their psyche throughout this time period. So I think, that does go into it, but just to kind of see when you let people off the ropes in a situation like this, and this is the result, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people killed, raped, kidnapped, everything that's not nailed down is stolen. Like, I keep thinking back to, you hear about like ancient looting in medieval times. And, we talked about when Jerusalem was sacked, they even had rules of war of you had 72 hours to loot and do whatever you wanted. Then after that, we would stop. And, we don't have great documentation of exactly what the details were of, when the Crusaders sacked Jerusalem for the first time. But here we do. And I wonder, like, back then they even had to have rules around, okay, you can go nuts for a little bit, but we have to stop it, because if we don't, you get a Nanjing where all hell breaks loose for basically until there's nothing left and the whole city's burnt to the ground and things start to kind of calm down on their own, where, back in the day, they're saying, okay, you have 72 hours and then we have to put a hard stop to this, because if we don't, there's going to be nothing left. And I think it's just a very scary and really just disappointing part of humanity that you have large groups in a warfare setting, these are things that can happen. And it's like the scale, I can't get over this scale too, just the amount of just carnage and bloodshed and everything that happened here outside of a battle, just military on military, but also civilian violence is, it's at another level.
Yeah, there's a degree of like medieval barbarism that I know so hard to really comprehend. I think you made an interesting, parallel point with, the Holocaust. There is this kind of government sanctioned industrial, lens to it. But with the massacre in Nanjing, it is just an onslaught. Like there's no planning about this. The soldiers just go crazy when they get in there. And, military leadership seemingly turns a blind eye. And I think to me, that's one of the crazy takeaways of this is, I think you use the analogy of, having too long of a leash. And, this is an example of where there seemingly there was no leash at all, right? It was just, an open season on the population of Nanjing. And, here we are, 300,000 lives in one estimate lost, countless women, sexually assaulted in the most gruesome way possible. Stories that, are haunting to a certain degree. And in the middle of all of this is the International Safety Zone trying to protect as many people as they can.
Could you imagine being Rabe and these guys, and we see it in his diaries, right? It's, the Japanese are here, and then, oh my God. And then it's like he explains a little bit of what's going on in horror, and then it's just back to business. Okay, well, I got to figure something out here. There's people here. I woke up today, this happened. And some of the things that he talks about, right, is, he talks in some detail, the things he's seeing, the violence, the looting, the rape. He says there's a story where he sees a soldier about to rape a woman, and he erupts, and the wording was hot fury, roars at the soldier, starts screaming at him in German and throwing his swastika armband in his face, grabbing the man by the nose and the collar and threw him out of the house. And like, these are stories where Japanese soldiers would run into a house. You can put two and two together about what they're about to do. And someone, the neighbor running to John Rabe going, you got to help us, because they knew he was one of the only people that the Japanese would listen to. When they saw that swastika, they're like, oh yeah, that's our ally. We could get in trouble for this. And so he's basically every day going around the city, people going, hey, there's soldiers in there doing some terrible things, or they're looting this house. And he would run in, start throwing guys out like a bouncer almost, and waving his swastika in their face. But imagine the risk and all that. All it takes is one soldier to turn around and go, who the heck are you? And shoot him in the head, essentially. And he gets very close in some situations. But for the most part, just being able to yell at them in German and show his swastika armband seems to do the trick in most cases. But again, he's one guy in a massive city with a huge army and hundreds of thousands of civilians. He can only do so much, and he's trying his best with the safety zone, and more people are starting to pour in. And he's writing letters to the Japanese government, basically trying to say, like, what the heck is happening here? He's trying to write back to Hitler to get help. He actually used his German flag and put it on the roof of his house to hopefully that, Japanese bombers wouldn't attack his house. And, just like any little thing that he can do, he's trying to do. But, he's going to the Japanese military leaders and saying, look what's happening. And they're like, well, what can we do? Or they'd say, oh yeah, we'll look into it. And then, nothing would happen. And, they would come to him trying to ask him for favors, and he's trying his best to balance this, but it's pure chaos. And he's trying to do, the little parts that he can, within this whole crazy situation.
And this goes on for months, right? I think that is something important. This isn't a few weeks of massacre. The city's captured in December 1937, and the military consolidates its control over Nanjing, but the violence begins to subdue in spring of 1938. So there's 4 or 5 months of this onslaught of inhumanity. And then you see, the initial chaos of unrestrained violence kind of gives way to a more organized military administration. The safety zone, despite its shortcomings, did, impact and stop some of these atrocities from being committed. And I would imagine did contribute to the reduction in the scale of violence to some degree. And obviously, as the war goes on, Japan becomes more focused on consolidating their power and control over the broader region, and preparing for further military campaigns versus just the extreme, brutality that they've been doing in Nanjing for those, 3 to 5 months.
Yeah. And I think when you look at the massacre itself, it's kind of slotted at 6 weeks of this chaos. And part of the cynic in me is saying, yeah, things kind of cooled down when, the military took over, but was there anything left? Was there any people really left? Was there stuff to loot? It is nice kind of once the military dictatorship or military administration kicks into gear, you do start to see some people come back to the city and it starts to become a city again. But yeah, for that, 6 weeks plus 3 or 4 months, like hell on earth, I don't even think is a way to, describe it. And so I've got a little excerpt here from his diary. And it just, again, I like to ground this whole situation into, this is just an example of just what he's going through on a day-to-day basis, an hour-to-hour basis. So he says, 6 Japanese climbed over my garden wall and attempted to open the gates from inside. When I arrive and shine my flashlight in the face of one of the bandits, he reaches for his pistol, but his hand drops quickly enough when I yell at him and hold my swastika armband under his nose. Then, on my orders, all 6 have to scramble back over the wall. My gates will never be open to riffraff like that. There are large fires spreading to the north and to the south of my house. Since the waterworks have been destroyed and the firemen have been taken away by the soldiers, there's nothing we can do. In Gofo Lo, it looks like as if the whole blocks of houses is burning down. The sky is bright as day. The 300 to 400 refugees here in my garden, I no longer know how many of them are really there. They use straw mats, old doors, and sheets of tin to build houses for little protection against the snow and cold. Unfortunately, they started to cook inside these huts. I had to forbid it out of fear of fire. I'm so afraid fire will break out, for there are still 64 large cans of gasoline stored on the gardens. I've ordered that cooking only be done in 2 places in the garden. And that's just one day in one paragraph, wrapping up a day for, John Rabe within this craziness. And I think here this is business, right? He's like, I got to deal with these Japanese guys jumping over my fence, trying to steal stuff from my house and trying to do God knows what to the people in my garden. And I got to make sure that they don't burn the place down, but the whole city's on fire. I can't do anything about it. More refugees are coming because their houses are burning down. I don't even know how many people are here, but I have to put some order together. So I said, yeah, okay, we can only cook in these 2 areas. And it's only a couple paragraphs, but my goodness, right? Just this is what this guy's got to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And, he's not even he's not someone whose home has been burned down and they're trying to find, to get to the safety zone or wherever they need to get to.
Yeah, it just seems like at every turn you have to contend with something, right? The external threat of the Japanese, or just like ensuring the safety of the safety zone internally in some degree to make sure that, those people within that 3 to 4 square kilometer, boundary aren't making the mistakes that are going to put the safety zone up into flames, or worse, let people in and et cetera. And that's just, to your point, that's one paragraph.
Yeah.
He did this for months.
Yeah. And he talks about too, right? Like, he's like, I'm doing this for months and every day. And then he talks about the biggest problem is Chinese soldiers are ripping off their uniforms, putting on civilian clothes, and basically trying to get into the safety zone because they know what happens when, the Japanese, they are taking prisoners, but for the most part, they're not taking prisoners. They're trying to hide in there. And then the Japanese figure out what's going on. And so the Japanese are using it as a way to come in, basically looking at anyone who might be a soldier and accusing them of being a soldier. And then that's an excuse also to find women in the zone. And again, where that goes. So it's incredibly tough, but you're right. It starts to taper out. And thankfully there's some level of order in Nanjing, but my goodness, the level of violence and all these things, it can't even really be quantified properly, and you can't really even put it in your head. But he does decide in 1938 in February that he's going to leave Nanjing after everything that he saw. I think, getting a change of scenery is probably something that he really needs. But again, he's leaving his home. This has been his home for 20 years. So he leaves to Berlin in April of that year. He carried with him extensive documentations of the atrocity committed by the Japanese forces. And, this is a huge risk, right? Because to get out of China, he has to go down the Yangtze River to get to Shanghai and board a boat. And as you may recall, who owns Nanjing, Shanghai, that whole river, it's all Japanese controlled. So there was a big risk that the Japanese found him with this information that it could have been really bad for him. So he gets back to Germany, and first thing he does is he starts giving lectures on what he saw. He writes to Adolf Hitler. He sends him all of his evidence, and he's been gone for a while. He's a little naive about this Nazi regime. He really held this patriotic view, and he goes, Hitler wants peace. There's no way that he's not going to step in and make sure that this doesn't happen. He also thought, Hitler would be really shocked by everything that he sees, and he'll address this with the Japanese, and he may even change his policies with the Japanese. And again, talk about naive, right? This is 1938. Hitler's only going to be alive for 7 more years. Kristallnacht's already happened. The amount of anti-Semitism is at a crazy level, and they're preparing for war. It's a huge misstep, I think, from his perspective. But again, we can give him some leeway that he hasn't been in the country for a while. But he tries, right? He tries to get this in front of the highest-ranking people in Germany, and we don't know for sure if it got to Hitler's desk, but it definitely made its way up the chain within German high command.
There's almost like a degree of naivety to a certain degree, right? And it's hard not to classify it that way. But again, I think it almost, in a way, for us or other historians, kind of does speak to how far he was removed from the actual Nazi party on the ground. Like we're talking, like you said, 7 years more Hitler has. The war machine is full-fledged, like the momentum's going. Anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. War's about to break out. And, here is John Rabe, who's like, help me. Let's do something about what happened. And I think that naivety, in many ways, you could kind of see it as like a reductive point and maybe even like a mark against him. But in my mind, I think it just goes to show you, despite the fact of him being a Nazi member, I don't think it actually meant or actually, manifested all that much in reality to what his ideological views were.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you look at Japan, right, they're an ally of Germany. There's some risk to this, right? Like Hitler's not going to like that you're saying that his ally is, out of control and doing these atrocities. And it's, a big shame for Germany on the world stage that you're allied with this country that's doing these terrible things. And to be honest, that's kind of what happened. So he sends these reports, and then eventually the Gestapo comes knocking on his door and decides, hey, we want to speak to you. And essentially, he's interrogated for a few days. And basically, the agreement is you are forbidden from ever speaking or writing publicly about your experiences in Nanjing. He actually had a film that was documenting the atrocities. This was confiscated. And so for John Rabe, he's like, what the heck is happening? And he writes in his journal, he says, in Nanjing, I'm a living Buddha to tens of thousands of Chinese people. But now in Germany, I've become untouchable and abandoned by society. And so he's not sure, like, who is he now? Like, he's coming from this world where he's seen the worst of the worst, but is respected by the people. Now he comes to a place where he thinks he's doing the right thing, and he's been kind of ostracized. And, he's now got a limited role with Siemens. He's not able to get a big responsibility. He's working as a clerk and managing some foreign affairs for the employees of Siemens, and even connected to some internment camps as well, because German industry is involved in that. And, he basically said, during the arrest, he's like, yeah, I stand 100% by the central thrust of German policy. I'm loyal to the Nazi party. Continues to do that. And I think, again, there's, a lot of naivety here. Like you were saying, Richie, he doesn't really fully understand, I think, what's going on, as many Germans didn't at this point. But he's a loyal German, and he's like, okay, this is what I have to do, but who am I now? Where do I fit into this society? And, it's World War II. In a few years, things are going to start to go really badly for the Germans. And, towards the end of the war, you start to see a little bit of that collective guilt that's coming to many Germans. And he's starting to realize, yeah, there's some pretty bad behavior of what we're doing in Russia, and some of these party members are doing some pretty crazy things, and you start to see a little bit of a change in a tune. So I think for him, and to your point that you mentioned, off the top of him being a Nazi, he definitely was, I think he had a version of what the Nazi party was and what the German government was for a very long time, but, starting to witness it firsthand, the arrest, he definitely starts to sour, up to the end of the war.
It's kind of a grand irony though, right? In some ways, like here is this Nazi member in China saving people from a military atrocity to come home to Germany in the midst of what is seemingly the other greatest systematic genocide of all time. And he's like, what am I doing? Like, why is no one listening to me, right? Here's a guy who's just trying to do some good stuff and raise awareness and, live by his laurels. But in many ways, they are in complete contradiction to the regime that is in power.
It's really, yeah, you're right. It must be so disheartening for him. Like, he did the right thing in China. He did the right thing in Germany. And it helped in China, but it's still all the terrible things that happened. And then in Germany, it essentially went nowhere. Like, that's gotta hurt, right? But luckily for him, the war ends, because life during the war was terrible. Germany's just getting pummeled with bombs. His family falls into poverty during the war. He's still working at Siemens. He's doing some translation work, but, such a meager income. It's really difficult, like him and many other Germans, to really make ends meet. But the problem is the war's over, which should be great. He can get back to normal. But he's a Nazi, card-carrying Nazi. And essentially, when the Allies come in, anybody who's a card-carrying Nazi is under deep scrutiny. So he's basically under a lot of serious accusations. Someone was tipped off that and basically said, hey, he was part of the Nazi party and was running things in China and all of these things. And he's basically dragged in this prolonged lawsuit of what's called denazification, which essentially consumes all his money and energy. Because essentially at this point, the Allies are basically trying to find who are the worst Nazis. You have Nuremberg trials and all of these things, and they're trying to put the worst of the worst, behind bars or in some cases, executed. And so, his family's now living in a really small room. They're suffering from hunger and cold, malnutrition, just the mental torture on him as well is just so awful, to add to all of the physical ailments that he has. And this is just an awful, awful time for him because, again, he's essentially labeled as a Nazi. There's really no opportunity for him. He's trying to survive, and he's worried every single day that he's going to get picked up by the police. And so I found a few excerpts from his journals, and I think this really shows the life that he's living between 1945 and 1946. So the first entry is, Siemens did not have a vacancy for me. I lost my job. And that's it. That's all he wrote that day. Very straightforward. Next day he goes, we suffer from starvation. I have nothing to tell, and thus I won't write anything. Besides such miserably little food, what we have is only acorn flour porridge. My wife has collected some acorns. Now we don't have any ration food. We only eat nettles and horns every day. So he's essentially dirt poor and barely scraping by. He has another entry where he says, yesterday my application for denazification was rejected. As the chairman of the International Committee to the Nanjing Safety Zone, I've saved the lives of 250,000 Chinese. The reason of such rejection is that I served as the head of the Nazis in Nanjing just for a while. I, with my intellect, should not have joined the Nazis. I plan to appeal. I don't give the opportunity of work. If they don't give me the opportunity to work for Siemens, I don't know how I'll make a living. Therefore, I have to keep fighting, but I am too tired, and I'm constantly interrogated every day by the police. Then the last entry, June 3rd, the Denazification Committee of the British occupied area in Charlottenburg cleared my name from the Nazis. The verdict brought to an end this spiritual torture. Many friends and leaders from Siemens congratulated me. Siemens even granted me a vacation so I could recover from my previous pressure.
Granted him a vacation. Wow, that's incredible. It's hard to imagine how someone who saved 250,000 lives during one of the worst massacres in modern history, and British forces couldn't figure out that maybe this guy wasn't actually a Nazi in the sense that they thought. It's incredible. It's incredibly short-sighted. And I think this kind of goes to his legacy in many ways though, right? Like his legacy is probably as complicated as the time he existed in. Right. It's so hard to parse that reality out of the two. I think for us, it's easier, right? Like, we've had time to reflect. We've read his diaries. We've read other books, and we can come together with I think you and I are seeing eye to eye here, that, he did not deserve this in any way, shape or form.
For sure. And I get from the British and Allied standpoints, it's hard. Everybody's going, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not one of the bad ones. Sure. And, I'm sure, but, it did take some time. But the fact that he was so poor, and I think the one thing is, it sounds like the people at Siemens, they knew who he was, or they knew the work that he did, and they tried their best to keep him going. But also, Siemens, they're doing some things during the war too, which I'm sure they're going to have to figure something out for that wasn't the most positive. So at least from a Siemens perspective, it seems like, hey, look, take a paid vacation, enjoy yourself for a little bit. We'll get you back. We'll get you to a point where you can start living again. But this is where the beauty of humanity comes back into all of this. Word gets back to China about all of this. The word is basically, remember John Rabe? Remember the hero John Rabe? He's basically living in dirt. He's dirt poor. He's eating nothing. And the people of Nanjing are like, oh my God, like we have to do something. We have to help him out. So in just a few days, the citizens of China, who again, also not doing very well after 10 plus years of war, scrounged together as much money as they can. And they actually raised almost $2,000 back in the late 40s, which is quite a bit. And in March, the Nanjing's mayor travels to Switzerland, and he purchases essential foods like milk, powder, sausages, and coffee, and mails basically like a big care package to John Rabe, basically saying, hey, from your friends in Nanjing. And then after that, the people in Nanjing were taking a little bit of food every month, packaging it up and sending it over to Nanjing, to John Rabe. And I would pay a lot of money if there was a time machine and I could go back to any time in history. I think I might go back just to see the look on John Rabe's face when that care package shows up and it says, from your friends in China, thank you for everything. We got your back. You had ours, we got yours. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful, I think way to kind of wrap up this story is before we kind of get to the very end is, people recognize him. The people that matter, I think the most in this story, they recognize what he did. And, he didn't ask for anything. He just wanted to live his life and work for Siemens again and support his family. And the people of Nanjing, for whatever help that was, it helped get him back on his feet so he could, at least enjoy the last few years of his life.
I think that's probably the most powerful sentiment for me is that on both sides of this story, starting with Rabe and then the people of Nanjing, it's people doing the right thing when it mattered. And I think you see that on, bookends of this story. And I think to me, that's probably the most important, powerful takeaway. Whatever regimes change, regimes fall and come to power every day, governments fall and lose power every day. But there's still this kind of hopeful element of, amongst all the loss of humanity, that there's still people who are willing to, put their neck out and do the right thing and then reciprocate it for those who are deserving of it. I think that's that's a part of the story that really really hits home for me.
Absolutely. And I think we talked about it last week with Robert, right? When we talked about why fight. And he made a great point. He said, you fight for the buddy next to you. And it's a similar sort of situation here is John Rabe was fighting for his neighbors, his employees, his friends. And then they flipped it and they said, hey, you know what? You're our friend. You're our neighbor. You were the person who took us in when the worst of the worst was happening. We got you, right? And I think it's such a beautiful thing. And the people of Nanjing, haven't forgot him. So in 1950, at the age of 67, John Rabe passes away from a stroke. A lot of mental anguish, a lot of physical anguish for these years. His health catches up with him. But in 1997, his tombstone is actually relocated from Berlin to Nanjing, where it now holds a place of honor at the Nanjing Massacre Memorial. And in 2005, his former residence in Nanjing was restored. And then in 2006, it was opened as the John Rabe and International Safety Zone Memorial Hall. So to this day, the people of Nanjing have not forgot him, and they've put time, energy, money into really honoring his memory and basically saying thank you, John Rabe, and your tombstone is here and you're one of us and you'll never be forgotten.
I think it's a powerful and rightful end to a very horrific and sad story. Mm-hmm. From where we started to where we ended. I think it does show you this kind of redemption arc that humans are possible of amidst all the horror and darkness that they can inflict on each other.
Yeah, I'm wrapping this up thinking I was going to be feeling more depressed and kind of sad, but I'm a little bit more, I think, emotional and happy to say, like we said, the worst of the worst happened, but we saw the best. And I think that's, a really great way to kind of wrap it up. And I'm going to end just with a quick quote from John Rabe. And I think it goes to show to anybody that, no matter what happens, and doing the right thing is a great way to live, I think is probably the way to do it. And so he says, I have to see these atrocities with my own eyes so that I can narrate them as a witness. Facing the brutal enormity, we shall not be silenced anymore. John Rabe.
Well, I think it's never wrong to do the right thing.
Exactly. And especially in a situation where the worst is happening, when you try to do the right thing, even if you're 1% successful, you're going to make a difference. And I think John Rabe did that, and he continued to try to do the right thing until the end of his days, and doesn't necessarily rewarded for it in material things, but I would love to see the math on how many people he saved and how many people are alive today because of the work that John Rabe did. I'm sure it's in the hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions. So I'm glad he's getting the recognition he deserves, and I'm glad the people of Nanjing won't forget him.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Awesome. All right, we'll wrap up on that note. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.